always, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Let's start by, and most people know about multi-assets and multi-asset funds. So let's start by what you think about that first question which I have. Should everybody consider investing, or is it a very specific type of investor that looks at multi-asset?
Multi-assets, I think, Alex, is a great place. It's a great category because it does provide the potential for upside while containing the downside. So the falls, are much lesser. And I'll just give some data, first to talk about this. So let's say if we are talking about Nifty 50, Nifty 50 being the benchmark of the Indian markets, in the last 7 years, if we look at the 5 biggest falls, the biggest one was during COVID when Nifty 50 fell by about 38%, and the least was somewhere in 2019 when it fell by 11.95%. And what we saw from September till about March 4th was the 15.77% fall on Nifty 50. So if you're just looking broadly at this data, we see that the category average multi-asset funds at all times have fallen much, much lesser than Nifty 50. For example, 15.77% was the recent fall for Nifty, and the category, the multi-assets, fell by 8.07%, and 24 out of the 25 schemes, were able to contain the downside lesser than Nifty 50 fall. The highest returns being 3.16% positive, and the lowest being 21%. So that was the only scheme which actually fell more than Nifty 50. But if we look at all other periods, prior to COVID, we had much lesser schemes. So we had about 6 schemes, 5 to 6 schemes. And in all these other 4 periods which we've tracked for Nifty 50, we see that there's a 100% rate when the returns have been lesser than Nifty 50, and many of the good schemes have been able to give the upside and higher returns than the benchmark markets. So that's point number one, that they do have the potential to contain the downside. And I think second, they are really useful if you do have a 3 to 5 year horizon, or you're stuck in markets like the current situation where there is volatility and there is some bit of, let's say, lack of direction, Alex. I think these are times when this category can emerge to be one of the better ones because it will move across different asset classes. It will give you gold, it will give you silver. Silver has been, I think we've seen so many NFOs for silver. So rather than going and investing in a silver fund and taking on the whole risk onto yourself, probably the fund managers have a better and a clear vision of how gold, silver can move. And of course, the opportunities in the equity markets as well. For example, you spoke to White Oak, and they have actually increased their equity allocation. Not many people, Alex, in these times will have the risk appetite probably to increase the allocation. So these funds somewhere are able to do it in an automated way, a bit of, let's say, emotionless way. So overall, it's a great category, and I think it can find place in majority of the portfolios. Even if you have, pure equity and pure fixed income, I think it can still find place.
Okay, so we'll talk about some of that. And also a major advantage, of course, is that you don't have to book capital gains at any given point of time. The fund does it for you. So when you're switching here and there, what happens invariably is that you lose because you're booking either short-term or long-term capital gains, and that can be a significant erosion in what you earn. But
Absolutely.
The thing is, Prableen, that we spoke with White Oak Capital, of course, and there are quite a few schemes available. They all run it differently. So how do you understand how this product should be looked at?
Yeah, that's the problem here actually, Alex, because there's too much of variety, and then for a retail investor, it's not easy for him or her to go and study all schemes and decide which one is well suited. And I think the two extremes here would be, on one hand, you have a scheme like Edelweiss multi-asset allocation. They have a purely hedged equity portfolio. So it's arbitrage purely. And even gold and silver holdings are hedged. Only the fixed income, what they are investing in government bonds and fixed income, other money market and everything is the regular fixed income which they have. So everything is hedged. And of course, there will be a capping on the upside because they are not taking any unhedged equity exposure, but they are able to contain the downside. The structure is very different. On the other extreme, we have schemes like Motilal, which have gone up to 65-70% in equity also. And even in times when markets were really reaching, higher levels in terms of valuations, their allocation towards equity was high. And probably that is why the fall that we saw in their particular fund. But then there are some schemes, Alex, I feel, which are somewhere in between. And just that, it gets complex But for example, SBI, ICICI, White Oak, I think they've done a great job in the last 1 year, although we still have limited, track record in terms of how they would be in the other market cycles. But if you look at Nippon, I think these funds have been able to give you a balanced exposure to the different asset classes. So I think for any investor, when they're going and picking a multi-asset allocation fund, I think the balance within different assets is important. And of course, how much of downside protection these schemes have been able to give. But majority of them have made good and agile movements from trimming. White Oak trimmed their gold exposure. SBI, for example, brought it down from 9 to 3% in the last 1 month. So probably they're booking profits as well, and taking this opportunity to probably increase the equity exposure. So overall, a bit of confusion there, but I think if investors, if they are sure about their need and they can have their advisor or somebody suggest them, I think the right fund for themselves.
Yeah, 100%. And what you pointed out has actually borne out. Now, I started the conversation saying, should you consider investing in it at all? And you've pointed out that there are advantages to be had. But the question is, where does it fit in your portfolio? If you do have equity, if you have fixed income, how much allocation should you take? On what basis do you decide how much you should have?
So I think some pockets, how we can look at adding this, Alex. Number one, for example, if I have to increase my equity exposure and I'm not very comfortable investing in a mid cap or a small cap, I have a 5 to 7 year view. I feel that may be risky, but I want equity exposure. So from within multi-assets, probably I can pick a scheme which has a decent equity allocation because there is a structure which is given for all the different schemes. How much will be the sort of the movement for that particular scheme. For example, somebody has the 10 to 80% range, somebody has the 35 to 65% range. So if you can find a scheme which is slightly more equity oriented, which will always maintain that exposure, then that can be an addition within your equity portfolio, because that can help me reduce my downside risk. So while I'm going to add equity, and look at some downside protection. Likewise, Alex, for somebody, I think with the 3 to 5 years is always a very, very tricky time. How do you take allocation? How do you decide where to invest for 3 to 5 years? It's a tricky time period. And I think that is where these funds can really fit in. I think third very important usage is as an SWP. So, for example, when you're heading towards retirement, even before that, you can actually start building up your allocations in this kind of a hybrid fund, so that can be your first bucket from where you start your systematic withdrawal while your other equity schemes continue to grow. For the college education of your children, so horizon-wise. So I think there are a lot of ways where this can be added. And I think the very important, category of investors who can look at it, who are graduating from, let's say, pure fixed income towards equities. So for them also, maybe a conservative fund can be a good starting point of somebody who's just starting off. So, like zor ka jhatka, probably little dheere for them when they enter equities.
Well put. Not that you should make a decision based on tax at all, but since you mentioned fixed income versus multi-asset, a lot of people are gravitating towards hybrid funds because of the better tax treatment on it. Ultimately, all fixed income is, whatever you earn from that is taxed at slab rate. Whereas a multi-asset fund, like other hybrids, you get that 12.5% taxation. You want to explain that?
So this is actually one of the real good points of being in the multi-asset category, Alex, because we do have the variation as well. For example, Edelweiss is a safe kind of a fund within the multi-assets. It went up by 3.16% during this fall when Nifty was down by 15.5%. So one can definitely consider this kind of a fund. But still, if you are looking at substituting your pure fixed income, I think investors should be prepared for some downside risk. That has to be borne in mind that, okay, maybe there is some sort of a dip which can happen, but it can be a good substitute for somebody who can have that heart to take bit of exposure towards equities, little risk, and then you're looking at better taxation, because there are a lot of funds which if they are holding about 35% in equity, qualify for the 12.5% taxation after 2 years, and the others are qualifying for 12% taxation after 1 year. But of course, this is a category overall we should think of, 2 years plus. So we can say that it's going to give you 12.5% taxation, which is great.
Yeah.
And I think, Alex, the only point here is that it can't be like you just cannot go look at the past returns and pick something, because that can be really detrimental to your portfolio.
Important point that you're making there, Prableen. But so therefore, last question, a slightly quick answer, running out of time. So difficult to put a benchmark in place in terms of what your return expectation should be, but still, what should investors bear in mind, and what do you like in the space?
I think it should be around Nifty 50. So if you've picked a conservative multi-asset, then maybe 1 or 2% less or around Nifty 50. And if you picked a slightly the regular with 65% exposure, which can take up to 65% exposure, I would want my fund to be maybe 1-2% plus Nifty 50, which has happened in the past. We do have the returns, those kind of returns. And what I like, Alex, I think Edelweiss, for somebody who's really conservative, I think White Oak, we've started studying. It seems to be a good strategy. They've been able to contain the downside. They've been 0.67% up during this fall, the 15.5% fall for Nifty 50. I think Nippon, SB, and ICICI are some of the others. So I think these 5, so based on which one will suit you. But of course, investors should do their own due diligence.
Absolutely. You said it. Thanks so much, Prableen, for joining in. Pleasure speaking with you as always.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
All right, that brings us to the end of this edition of Your Money Matters. Thanks so much for watching. This is NDTV Profit.